3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
There is no other institution that has the ability, uniquely,
without a heritage, every generation starts over.
to remind the current regime
what your country.
We, the people, tell the government what it is allowed to do.
to get back in their box and stay there.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
From the Heritage Foundation, this is Heritage Explains.
Welcome back to Heritage Explains. It's a new year, and it promises to be a big one. As the inauguration of Donald Trump for a second term in the presidency nears, conservatives are preparing for a new way of governing in Washington. The last 4 years have been spent casting a new vision for America, a vision that reduces the power of the entrenched bureaucracy, more responsibly uses American resources, and respects the rule of law. One of the key components of that vision is securing the southern border. President Trump campaigned heavily on this issue, and now it is time to implement policy to deliver. To get a sense of what the Trump administration may pursue in the first 100 days, I sat down with Simon Hankinson, Senior Research Fellow in the Border Security and Immigration Center here at the Heritage Foundation. Simon Hankinson, welcome back to Heritage Explains.
Thanks for having me.
We're coming up on the inauguration of the second Trump administration, coming up on January 20th. Obviously, the first 100 days of any incoming presidential administration is extremely important for achieving those objectives. And what we'd like to talk about today is specifically objectives around the border. This was a really important topic during the election. What do we expect? What do we expect to see the Trump administration prioritizing as far as our southern border in the first 100 days of the administration?
Well, I think as a theme, the strategy will be to undo all of the things that have clearly opened the border and become a giant magnet to bring people in the last 4 years. And in the first Trump administration, they kind of felt their way through. They had obviously a lot of experience, a lot of people who knew what they were doing, but they were faced with some unusual circumstances, and it took them a while to figure out the most effective technique to keep the border as closed as possible, to remove those people who were deportable, and to secure the country. And now they've seen 4 years of what happens when you just undo all of that. And I think they are much better prepared and have a better plan ready to go, hopefully from day one, to try to turn off that giant magnet and enforce the law in the interior and also at the border so that people all over the world who've been coming in basically unstopped for 4 years will realize that their odds of getting in have just gone down considerably, and hopefully not spend the money and take the physical risk of trying to enter the United States illegally.
What do we see as some of the key policy pieces that the Trump administration is going to bring in?
Well, first, you could look at the actual the border itself, the southern border. The northern border is a different question. It's a much lower scale, but it's concerning as well. But let's just talk about the southern border, where on the worst month in U.S. history, which happened to be a year ago, this December in 2023, there were something like 350,000 people encountered attempting to enter the United States illegally or being processed, even though they were inadmissible by parole and various other means. So how do we reestablish some control over the southern border where it's just not possible to walk over, surrender to Border Patrol, and be immediately released with pretty much a very low chance of being deported? You've got to finish that project that President Trump started in his first administration of building a wall, meaning not necessarily the exact same structure right across the almost 2,000 miles of border, but some physical impediment, whether it's an actual physical wall or other means to stop people being able to just literally walk over. We can have lights and sensors and cameras and other ways to concentrate Border Patrol agents in the places where there's the most activity. A lot of that was begun and then turned off by the Biden administration when they took over. I mean, you could see huge piles of rusting fence and building materials. I've seen it down there on the border where they just lay down tools on January 20th or 21st. And there were sensors and equipment that were just turned off or neglected or not repaired. So all of that could be put back in working order. Then you need to get the Border Patrol agents out there patrolling the border instead of in tent processing centers, handing out, bottles of water and diapers and prescriptions and trying to get people tickets to go wherever they needed to go and handing them over to non-governmental organizations that are funded by the federal government. You've got to go back to the basics of enforcing immigration law, which requires that people caught entering the country illegally are detained until their cases have been fully heard, at which point a decision is made. Are they allowed to stay or do they have to go home? If you release them into the country, the odds of their being deported, if they're finally ruled removable, go down massively from, the 90% down to the teens. So it's a combination of enforcement at the border and enforcement in the interior. They have to resume deportations. The Biden administration put so many logistical and paperwork obstacles in the way of agents doing their job in terms of where they could go, what factors they had to take into consideration, and so on, that they were really not able to remove that many people. We have on the non-detained docket of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, I think it's moving up to 8 million people now. And of those, there are 650,000 that either have criminal convictions in the U.S. or are in the process, the criminal process. So there's an awful lot of people, I think 1.3 last time I checked, million foreign nationals, aliens who have final orders of removal, meaning they've gone through the whole due process and an immigration judge has said, I'm sorry, you don't qualify for any relief, you need to go home. Well, that's a backlog basically that's built up, not just under Biden, but let's say much more rapidly under Biden than under any previous president, that's going to have to be addressed. So really it's a full court press on every line of effort to try to reestablish the rule of law, make it much harder for people to stay illegally, and give them the impression all over the world that the United States is no longer just going to roll over and let everybody in, sine die.
Another really critical achievement of the first Trump administration were the agreements that they were able to put together with other countries. If you think specifically of safe third-party agreements and also of the migrant protection protocols, also called the Remain in Mexico policy. Could you take us through those two things? Do we expect the Trump administration to revive those kinds of agreements? What do you expect to see happen there?
I absolutely expect them to concentrate on getting those agreements back and cutting new ones with other countries. They're really all the same thing. Migrant protection protocols, sometimes called Remain in Mexico, sometimes called asylum cooperative agreements, sometimes called safe third country agreements. The basic idea is that if you are let's say, Somali fleeing government persecution in Somalia, and that's another question as to whether you're actually fleeing government persecution or, tribal warfare or crime or anything else. But let's just say you are a hypothetical asylum applicant and you're fleeing Somalia. You fly to Mexico and then walk up through Mexico and come to the United States. Well, Mexico is a safe third country you could have claimed asylum in. You have Indians from the Punjab who, frankly, and I've interviewed literally thousands of people from that part of India. They're not all rich, but asylum claims from that part of the world just simply aren't credible. But they're still able to make those claims, and they are flying into places like Nicaragua, sometimes into Mexico, but sometimes into Central America, and then coming up on buses through, they've already booked the tickets, the whole thing, package deal, right up to the U.S. border. Well, we had at one point safe third country agreements with, I think it was El Salvador and Guatemala. There were at least two, and we're working on others. And those agreements mean that if someone crosses through Guatemala, say, on the way to the United States, and of course then through Mexico, they're supposed to apply for asylum in Guatemala. And if they make it up to the United States, we can send them back to Guatemala so that they can apply there. Well, the impact of that is going to be that maybe not so many people are going to want to pay $10,000 to fly from the Punjab to Nicaragua and make their way up to the U.S. if they think they're going to be sent back to another country to make their asylum claim instead of being able to make it in the U.S. So I would think that there'll be a diplomatic effort to fire up all those agreements, which are really not very complicated. We have one with Canada to reinstate the Remain in Mexico program or something similar with Mexico, and to get as many countries as we can to sign on to this idea that people should not be able to asylum shop for the country they want to go to. They should, if they really are fleeing for their lives, make that claim in the first safe country that they get to.
So obviously, we've talked a lot about our southern border here on this podcast and, of course, within our political discourse more broadly because it is such a big issue. But as you mentioned, the northern border, our border with Canada, is one that is also an important issue and had a recent development in which the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau of Canada, has stepped down. Can you talk a little bit about that situation, how border issues might have contributed to the Prime Minister's move, and also what we can expect from the Trump administration vis-a-vis our relationship with Canada moving forward?
Well, Trudeau took power a decade ago, which is a very long time in politics. In the parliamentary system, 5 years might be a good run. 10 years is really long, and even very popular prime ministers like Margaret Thatcher, they tend to get thrown out after a certain amount of time. That's just the cycle of things. But I don't think it's just that for Trudeau. If you look at his record, he has made it much harder for Canadians in a resource-rich country to use their natural resources and their energy. He has persecuted people for expressing their opinions on things like COVID vaccines and gender ideology. He has doubled the national debt of Canada from like 600 billion Canadian dollars when he took over to 1.2 trillion 10 years later, which is something that the previous Conservative Prime Minister warned would happen. And then on immigration, the Liberal Party under Trudeau has just ramped up every category of migration to levels that even Liberal Canadians have realized are unsustainable. They have something like 3.5 million people have been added to the population just in the past 3 years. That's 7% of the population. They have 4.9 million people on short-term visas like student visas and work visas that are expiring in this coming year. I mean, imagine that. That's like the population of Scotland. All of a sudden, their visas are expired. And they deported only 10,000 people last year. So what happens if those 5 million people say, we're not going to go? And many of them are already saying, we're not going to go. They've got a real problem on their hands. Housing shortages, house prices have gone way up in the parts of Canada where migrants tend to go. Healthcare system is under crushing pressure, and the public have really had enough and want someone else to try to fix the mess that I think Trudeau made.
So the election of President Trump, the stepping down of Prime Minister Trudeau, we're seeing kind of a broader trend here in the way that folks in the West are looking at immigration. Would you agree?
Yes, I think the common theme is that there has been unprecedented mass legal and illegal migration over the past decade at least. And the populations of the recipient countries seem to have had enough, that the parties that are in favor of restricting immigration and enforcing the laws are doing better and better in elections in the U.S. and Canada, in Germany, in Italy, in France, really all across the Western, the developed world.
So one of the key components of Trump's vision on the border is deportation of folks who are within the borders of the United States illegally. And of course, the first half of that is actually the removal process, but really the second half is having somewhere for them to go, their country of origin or their home country or however you'd like to call it. One of the questions that we've seen pop up is, well, what do you do if these home countries do not want their people back? And how do we expect the incoming administration to deal with that situation?
The principle to start with is that every country has an obligation to take its citizens back. The United States will take every single American citizen back. We don't care how horrible they are, terrorists, criminals, they still come back home and we'll deal with them when they get here. So we should expect that of every country in the world, absolutely no exceptions. Now that said, there are some countries that make it hard for us to send their people back. For example, we had 20,000 Indians, 20,000 Chinese convicted criminal aliens in the United States last time I was working on this issue under the previous Trump administration. And those countries would make it really hard for us to send them back. They'd say, well, we don't think they're ours, or, well, we don't have time to go interview them to find out if they are ours, or, we don't have enough printer paper for our passports, or, whatever excuse they would make up. And we have to find ways to persuade them to do that job. We can use visa sanctions. We can just say, okay, fine, none of you can come here for any purpose ever. We can maybe start a little smaller than that, but that's where we end up with visa sanctions. We can use economic sanctions. We can use every means at our disposal to ensure that other countries obey that basic duty the way we would. So if Venezuela, for example, is saying, no, we're not going to take back, any of the hundreds of thousands of people who have gotten into our country illegally, even though our judges have ruled them not to be allowed to stay, we need to find ways to convince Venezuela to change its mind.
Simon Hankinson, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you to Simon Hankinson for his contribution to this episode. You can find more analysis by Simon at heritage.org, or you can follow him on X. Thanks as always to you for listening to Heritage Explains. You can reach out to us with any thoughts, questions, or suggestions at heritageexplains@heritage.org. Take care. We'll see you next week.
Heritage Explains is written and produced by Mark Gagne, Lauren Evans, and John Popp.